This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Recently, I caught the first season of Star Trek Discovery, and I want to talk about this because this is a brilliant show in some ways, and a clusterfuck in others. And I think it's really worth discussing. So, with this video, I'm going to break it down into two areas: the brilliance and the failure. Let's look at how this show is brilliant. First off, it is gorgeous. There was news in the trades about how Netflix, who actually virtually paid for the entire production of the first season of Star Trek Discovery, CBS All Access contributed, but not nearly as much. And this show is gorgeous. It is probably the most cinematic looking television show on television, frankly. It looks stunningly beautiful. And that's important because it manages to transcend, I know it's a streaming show, but television. It manages to transcend its medium in some ways. I mentioned that it's gorgeous to look at. It's also extremely well acted. And if you're like me, you love spaceship porn. I mean, I will watch a science fiction movie, never mind if the acting is good, bad, or indifferent, if the spaceships look awesome. That's the hook for me. Technology. I need to see that. I originally didn't like the early pre-production images I saw of the Discovery, based on a Ralph McQuarrie concept drawing, I believe. But seeing it in action, it's really a gorgeous ship. The key word, and I keep going back to this show, is that it's startlingly beautiful to watch. It's just remarkable. So let's look at the FX. A show can be brought down by not so good special effects. The special effects on Discovery are sublime, just really good. And once again, it goes to the earlier point. There's a lot of money thrown at this show, and it shows. And it's a feast for the eyes. I keep harping on how it looks. And that's important because that's its greatest strength. It's its visual presentation. And I think most importantly, Discovery is not necessarily designed for hardcore Star Trek fans. It upends, visually speaking, and I would argue even philosophically, the entire basis of Star Trek in lots of ways. And for someone who is not a part of that, it's refreshing. You don't need catch-up for Star Trek Discovery. They just throw you in and you can just swim right off the bat. It doesn't require tons of history to watch. So those are some of the reasons I think Star Trek Discovery is brilliant. Let's look at the failure. Starting with, I mentioned earlier that as a viewer, you don't need a lot of background to enjoy Star Trek Discovery, at least in the first season. Well, that's its problem as well. This show is built on the shoulders of Star Trek, a series that began, I believe, in the 60s, if I recall. I could be off on that. I don't claim to be a hardcore Star Trek fan. I did watch the show growing up, but I was more into British sci-fi, Space 1999, UFO, stuff of that nature. So it doesn't respect its history, and that's a problem in some ways. It's what I like to call the Snyder paradox, and that's based upon Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. Man of Steel is a terrible, awful Superman movie. It's a generally great alien invasion movie. Terrible Superman movie. And so what I call the Snyder paradox is simply creating something for one purpose, having it fail in that purpose, but having it work really well in another purpose. And that's what Star Trek Discovery is. It's a terrible Star Trek movie. If you're a hardcore Star Trek fan, I would hate this. I would despise this. it plays roughshod over central tenets of Star Trek mythology. I mean, well, it's been a while. I don't think I'm spoiling it for anybody. But if you've seen Star Trek Discovery, the first season, there's the spore drive, which some say is stolen, by the way, from a video game. But that's neither here nor there. You have the spore drive, which is powered by a tardigrade-like creature. It's not a tardigrade. It's, well, it looks like a tardigrade. In a series, they say it's not. But a tardigrade is what it most closely resembles. And so it's fairly obvious that Starfleet, being that this is clearly a sentient creature, would not have done, essentially torture it, to enable them to develop their spore drive. This would not have happened in Star Trek. It's so anti-Star Trek, in fact. And there's a lot of this in this show. It doesn't care. I never really got into the whole Kelvin timeline, the whole whatever timeline. A lot of this stuff is just corporate nonsense. And rights, having the right to use certain things, it's just way too deep in the rabbit hole. I didn't enjoy that, and I tend not to spend a lot of time on it. If it looked like something, it works for me. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And so this is not Star Trek. In fact, if you had gotten rid of all references to the Federation, to Star Trek in this episode, and it's not hard to do, by the way. They're present in uniforms and stuff, but they're really not terribly relevant to things. This would have been potentially a great show. Another problem with it is the characters are annoying and obnoxious and not great people. Dammit is just bitchy, and he is a gay character. I don't know if that's a commentary on that, but he's not likable. Again, at least within the first season. I could not stand him. He came about as arrogant and bitchy and pissy all the time. I could not stand his character. The ensign is just annoying and pushy and extremely passive-aggressive. And it's so tiring to watch these people. The only one, ironically enough, who is of any interest at all is Lorca. And as you've seen, he is a doppelganger. He is from the, the warlike timeline? The mirror universe, yes. He's from the mirror universe. And he's the most interesting character in the show because he makes sense. Michael Burnham, I don't particularly care about one way or the other. She's a character, and not my favorite character, again, Lorca, but I don't see all the animus against her. And speaking of Michael Burnham, remember, this is Spock's sister, not by birth. I believe she was adopted. But this is Spock's sister. If you're a Star Trek follower, this will drive you up the fucking wall because it makes no sense. They're inserting all types of things into the narrative that anyone who'd ever watched the series would see no hint of because it's not there. They're making it up. And that's a problem because they didn't have to do it. And another problem is the whole visual aesthetic of this show. It's so advanced. Keep in mind, this is essentially a prequel to the 1960s Star Trek. And I get, they're not going to go back to having knobs and buttons, especially in today's age. That's not going to happen. But conversely, you can better respect the technology that came before. It's not a hard thing. In fact, it's so easy. Having watched the first season, it shocked me how easy it would be. For instance, if you see the control room of the Discovery, way too advanced. It doesn't have to be that advanced. You don't have to stay at the level of Star Trek, which obviously would be nonsensical. But at the same time, you can make it work. Look at Enterprise. that should be the starting point. Base it upon similar design aesthetics. Move it forward, but only a bit. And while moving it forward, model it all after Enterprise, the Starship Enterprise, the interior set. Model it all after that. It should feel familiar to someone who watched Star Trek, even taking into account the essentially plasma-type displays all over the place. It should feel familiar. Nothing about Discovery feels familiar on a visual level. It's too far out, and it didn't have to be, which I mentioned earlier, the whole dispute within CBS. You have CBS, you have Viacom. Well, they're together now, but at the time of the making of Star Trek Discovery, they were not. And therefore, Viacom was behind CBS All Access, and they couldn't do certain things, which brought about the whole Kelvin timeline, the actual time. There's a name for it. It's eluding me at the moment. That brought that whole situation about. It's ludicrous. Again, I don't want to get involved with corporate politics when watching my movies. But Star Trek, at least this version, as I mentioned, they are one company again. We should see this stuff stop happening as a result of that, I think. But what you're seeing, even not knowing you're seeing it, you're seeing the outcome of corporate bullshit and nonsense and dumbness. And I don't want to have to know that. So, when all is said and done, Star Trek Discovery is a failure. It's a brilliant failure, though. I love this show. I liked watching it. But the thing is, I never watched it as a Star Trek series. Star Trek Enterprise, recognizably Star Trek. Star Trek Next Generation, recognizably Star Trek. These are in no particular order. Literally in the order they come off my head. Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And speaking of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, this is the direction they should have taken Star Trek Discovery in. Star Trek Deep Space Nine manages to question everything that's behind the Federation, but within the world of Star Trek itself. It doesn't place itself outside of it. Discovery, first season, exists entirely outside Star Trek. I don't care what anyone says. This is not a Star Trek show. It doesn't feel like a Star Trek show. It doesn't look like a Star Trek show. It doesn't act like a Star Trek show. I liked it immensely. That was great. It's also not Star Trek. Nothing about this says Star Trek to me. Deep Space Nine was, in my view, more subversive, more interesting, more dynamic within the Star Trek framework. And it's a brilliant show. I don't know if it's quite as appreciated as it should be. And so Star Trek Discovery took the easy way out, the cheap way out. It ignored aspects of Star Trek that it didn't want to deal with and kept those it did. And I need to mention another thing. It's a minor thing. What's with those uniforms? The uniforms are awful. They're awful for so many reasons. Aesthetically, they look like crap. They're not great looking uniforms. And also they have this piping on the sides, which shows off wrinkles. It shows off your physical anatomy in really odd ways. It's such an aesthetically unpleasing design. Why? It's part of what I mentioned earlier. Namely, this is not Star Trek. That uniform does not look anything like Star Trek. It's not aesthetically pleasing, but beyond that, it's just not a great looking uniform. I honestly don't understand it. It's really weird. It's gaudy. It looks almost like a dress uniform. I could see that, actually. During special occasions, and let's say state visits or whatever, they had that uniform. That would make sense. Other than that, why are they wearing it? It looks god-awful in practice. Now imagine someone sketching it, it'd probably look great. Outside of that, get rid of that. But on the whole, Star Trek Discovery, first season, I enjoyed it immensely. it is also a failure, a brilliant failure. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Peace.